The steady drumming of rain against the reinforced glass of the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, was the only sound that dared to punctuate the hum of the ventilation system. I traced a condensation trail with my fingertip, watching it snake its way down the pane, mirroring the path I felt my thoughts were taking, wandering, a little lost. Another Tuesday. Another body. My colleague, a sharp-eyed technician with perpetually ink-stained fingers, cleared their throat beside me. "They're ready for you, Blake. The transport just pulled in." I nodded, pulling on my gloves. The sterile scent of disinfectant and something faintly metallic, the usual perfume of my profession, filled my nostrils. It was a smell I'd grown accustomed to, a scent that clung to my clothes and my hair, a constant reminder of the work I did. This case, though, this one felt different. A call at this hour from a facility hours out of the city usually meant more than just a simple mishap. The way the dispatcher had phrased it, industrial accident, fatality confirmed, was clipped, efficient, and oddly devoid of detail. That was my first clue, the first whisper that this wouldn't be a straightforward report. The transport van, a nondescript white box, was already parked in the designated bay. The back doors swung open, revealing a gurney shrouded in a sheet. My colleague gestured, and two orderlies began the careful process of maneuvering it onto the examination table. The weight of it seemed to settle in the room, a palpable presence. "Victim is a male," the technician stated, reading from a tablet. "Dr. Elias Thorne, lead researcher at the Prometheus facility. Official cause of death, preliminary assessment from the on-site team, is electrocution. They say he was working late, troubleshooting some equipment." Electrocution, a common enough accident in a place that dealt with experimental energy sources. I circled the gurney, my gaze sweeping over the sheet. No obvious signs of trauma from a distance, no contorted limbs that screamed agony. Thorne's hands, I noticed as the technician began to pull back the sheet, were tucked neatly at his sides, almost as if he'd simply laid down to rest. That was odd. People don't usually die with their hands so composed. The technician peeled back the sheet, revealing Thorne's face. He looked peaceful, too peaceful. His eyes were closed, his skin pale, but there was no hint of the violent spasm that electrocution often inflicted. No scorched marks, no telltale signs of electrical discharge. I leaned closer, my brow furrowed. I ran a gloved finger along his jawline, then traced the curve of his ear. Nothing. The on-site report mentioned a significant surge. The technician offered, their voice low. Happened around midnight. Thorne was found by a security guard doing his rounds. And this equipment he was troubleshooting? I asked, my eyes scanning Thorne's body, looking for anything out of place. His lab coat was still buttoned, pristine. No tears, no singe marks. They said it's a new energy conduit prototype, highly classified. The technician gestured towards a series of photographs displayed on a nearby monitor. They showed Thorne in a brightly lit laboratory, hunched over a complex piece of machinery that looked more like an abstract sculpture than anything functional. Wires snaked everywhere, connected to blinking panels and humming components. Thorne, in the photos, was holding a tool, his concentration evident. "They're sending the equipment down," the technician continued. "Though they were hesitant, said it's sensitive." Hesitant, another flag. Why would they be hesitant to hand over evidence in a death investigation, unless the accident wasn't quite so accidental? I knelt beside Thorne, my gaze fixed on his chest. His lab coat was slightly askew, and beneath it I could see the fabric of his shirt. There was a faint discoloration there, a patch of something darker than the rest. "What's this?" I murmured, reaching for a sterile swab. I carefully dabbed at the discolored area. The swab came away with a faint, almost iridescent residue. It didn't look like soot. It didn't look like any burn mark I'd ever encountered. It shimmered under the harsh lab lights, a subtle, unnatural sheen. "What do you think it is?" the technician asked, leaning in. I shook my head, a knot tightening in my stomach. "I don't know yet, but it's not what I expected from an electrocution." The rain outside intensified, the drumming on the glass now a frantic rhythm, mirroring the sudden acceleration of my pulse. This wasn't just a simple industrial accident. Thorne hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Something else had happened here. and I had a feeling the Prometheus facility held more secrets than they were letting on. My determined nature, the very thing that made me good at my job, now felt like a heavy burden. The air in the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, hung heavy and still. It always did, this place. A sterile, controlled quiet that felt more like a held breath than peace. I'd been staring at the image on the monitor for a good 5 minutes, the digital rendering of the victim's chest cavity. Thorne, doctor. Elias Thorne, according to the preliminary report. A fall, they'd said. A simple, tragic accident at the research facility. But the report was thin, too thin. And the hesitation I'd felt from the facility's head of security, the way he'd practically guarded the initial findings like state secrets, it gnawed at me. Now, staring at this, the gnawing intensified. My fingers traced the outline of the anomaly on the screen. It wasn't a fracture, not a bruise from impact. It was a puncture, small, almost insignificant but precise. And the surrounding tissue showed a faint discoloration, a subtle darkening that didn't fit with blunt force trauma. Anything, Blake. The voice of the forensic pathologist, a stoic woman who preferred to be called the pathologist, cut through my thoughts. He was meticulously cleaning a surgical instrument, the soft rasp of metal on cloth, the only sound besides the drumming rain. I didn't look up. Just thinking. My eyes scanned the rest of the scan, the internal organs, the skeletal structure. Everything else appeared to be in order, no other signs of struggle or injury beyond what a fall might cause. Except for that one spot. Thinking isn't evidence, Blake, he stated, his tone neutral. She knew my reputation. I didn't do gut feelings without something to back them up. I know, I murmured. But this feels off. I zoomed in on the puncture site. It was too clean, too deliberate. A fall from that height, even onto hard ground, should have left a messier impression. This looked almost surgical. I pushed back from the console, the squeak of my chair echoing in the otherwise silent room. The pathologist paused her cleaning, her gaze finally meeting mine. There was a flicker of curiosity in her usually impassive eyes. The initial report mentioned a fractured skull and multiple contusions consistent with a fall, she said, her voice a low rumble. And what about this? I gestured to the screen. This isn't consistent with a fall. Not unless he fell onto something incredibly sharp and impassably narrow, and even then, the discoloration. I trailed off, the words not quite forming the complete picture in my head. It was like trying to grab smoke. She walked over, her movements deliberate. She peered at the screen, her brow furrowed slightly. That is unusual. She tapped a key, bringing up a different view, a cross-section. The depth suggests it penetrated the subcutaneous tissue, but not deeply into the muscle. And the toxicology screen, I asked, my mind racing through possibilities. Poison, a dart. Clean, she replied, already pulling up another file. No known toxins, no sedatives, nothing that would explain this. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. Clean, except for the impassable puncture wound that shouldn't be there. Let's look at the actual evidence, I said, my voice tight. The clothing Thorne was wearing. The initial examination was cursory, wasn't it? The pathologist nodded. Standard procedure for a presumed accident. Nothing indicated a need for a more thorough search of the garments. Well, now I think it does. I walked towards the evidence lockers, the rain outside picking up its tempo, a relentless drumming against the thick glass. Each locker was a small tomb, holding secrets. I pulled out the bag containing Thorne's lab coat and shirt. The plastic crinkled loudly in the quiet. I carefully laid out the lab coat on a sterile examination table. It was clean, remarkably so, considering the circumstances of his death. No bloodstains, no tears from a struggle. I unbuttoned it, my movements precise. Beneath, his shirt was similarly unmarked. Then I saw it, not on the shirt, but on the underside of the lab coat near the hem. A tiny, almost invisible snag. It was too small to be from his own clothing, too out of place. I carefully tweezed the fiber into a sterile collection vial. "What do you make of this?" I inquired, holding it up to the light. The pathologist leaned in, her magnifying lamp casting a focused beam. Synthetic, high tensile strength, not typical lab attire. My mind flashed back to the security chief at the facility, his uniform, functional, durable, and the way he'd stood so still, so controlled. This facility, I began, my voice low, it's cutting edge, right? Experimental tech. That's what I've heard, she replied, her gaze still on the fiber. They're very secretive about their projects. Secretive enough to have specialized equipment, I questioned, the question hanging in the air. Equipment that could leave a mark like the one on Thorne's chest. Equipment that might require specialized clothing to handle. The pathologist looked at me, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. You think this wasn't an accident, Blake? I carefully sealed the vial containing the fiber. I think, I answered, my gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, that doctor, Elias Thorne, didn't just fall, and I think this tiny fiber might be the first loose thread that unravels a much bigger secret. The tension in the room, already palpable, tightened another notch. This was no longer just a death investigation. This was something else entirely. The sterile hum of the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, was usually a comforting sound. It meant order, logic, a place where the chaos of the world could be dissected and understood. But today, it felt like a cage. The fiber I'd collected from Dr. Thorne's lab coat, a single strand of iridescent blue, sat under the microscope, taunting me. It wasn't wool, not cotton, not anything I'd encountered in my usual line of work. It was alien. A colleague, a technician with perpetually ink-stained fingers, shuffled in holding a steaming mug. Rough night, Blake, I grunted, not looking up. I could say that. This fiber is giving me fits. What is it? The technician peered at the magnified image, a faint shimmer of color against the stark white of the slide. That's the million-dollar question, I muttered. It's almost like spun glass but flexible, and the color shifts, like an oil slick but more intense. I adjusted the focus, my brow furrowed. The fibers were incredibly fine, almost impassably so, and strangely uniform. The technician took a slow sip of their drink. Never seen anything like it. I'm sure it's not just some weird synthetic from Thorne's equipment. That's what I thought initially, I admitted. But it doesn't match any of the materials listed for the facility's equipment. I cross-referenced the schematics, the material manifests. Nothing. It's like it materialized out of thin air. My gaze drifted back to the vial. Thorne had been working on something secret, something beyond the usual biochemistry or physics. The facility was notorious for its bleeding-edge research, funded by a shadowy corporation that preferred anonymity. I pushed away from the microscope, needing to move. Pacing the confines of the lab, I replayed the scene at Thorne's workstation. The overturned chair, the scattered papers, the faint scent of ozone that had clung to the air despite the ventilation. And then there was the security log. Thorne had been working late, alone. No one had entered or left his section of the research wing after 8 p.m. Yet, the preliminary report from the attending personnel stated he died sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. A 2-hour window where a life was extinguished, and no one was there. The security footage, I said, more to myself than the technician. It's supposed to be state-of-the-art. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, the works. How could someone get in and out without a trace? The technician shrugged. Maybe a glitch. Those systems aren't infallible. A glitch that coincided with a man's death. I stopped pacing, my eyes narrowing. And a glitch that somehow scrubbed any trace of entry or exit from the logs. I remembered the faint scuff mark near the ventilation shaft, barely visible on the polished concrete floor. It had seemed insignificant at the time, easily dismissed as wear and tear. Now, it felt like a signpost. I walked over to the evidence locker, pulling out the sealed plastic bag containing Thorne's personal effects. His wallet, his keys, a crumpled memo, and a small, tarnished silver locket. It was unusual for a man like Thorne, a theoretical physicist, to carry such an item. I'd almost overlooked it. Inside, instead of a photograph, were 2 tiny, dried flowers pressed flat. They looked like forget-me-nots. What was Thorne working on, really? I asked the question aloud, the hum of the lab suddenly feeling louder, more insistent. The official reports were vague, citing advanced materials research. But advanced materials didn't usually leave behind iridescent blue fibers, and they certainly didn't involve secret entrances. My mind flashed back to the senior administrator I'd spoken to at the facility, a man whose tailored suit seemed too expensive for the sterile environment. He'd been smooth, almost too helpful, steering me away from certain areas, emphasizing Thorne's unstable mental state and the tragic accident. He'd been quick to suggest suicide or a fall. Too quick. And then there was the rival researcher, a doctor, Anya Sharma. I'd seen her name on a few of Thorne's project proposals. Her work was in a related field, but with a decidedly more aggressive, competitive edge. She'd apparently clashed with Thorne on several occasions, her ambition a palpable force even in the hushed corridors of the facility. Could she have had a motive? Access? The facility was a labyrinth of controlled environments, but Thorne's lab was on the periphery, less monitored than the core research sectors. I picked up the locket again, turning it over in my gloved fingers. The forget-me-nots, a symbol of remembrance. There was Thorne trying to remember something, or trying to tell us something. The blue fiber, the scuff mark, the security anomaly, the administrator's eagerness to close the case, Sharma's ambition, pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit cleanly. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the reinforced glass. It felt like the sky was weeping, mirroring the unease churning in my gut. This wasn't a simple accident. This was a carefully constructed narrative, and I was just beginning to see the cracks. Thorne hadn't just fallen, he'd been silenced, and the killer was still out there, perhaps even watching. The thought sent a shiver, not of fear, but of grim determination, down my spine. I needed more answers, and I needed them fast. The fluorescent lights of the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, hummed a low, monotonous tune. It was a sound I usually found comforting, the soundtrack to my methodical work. But tonight, it felt like a prelude to something else, something unsettling. The chief medical examiner, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, had just handed me a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside, nestled on sterile carton, was a single, tarnished silver cufflink. "Found this tucked inside the deceased sark," she'd said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Odd place for it, wouldn't I agree? Odd was an understatement. I'd gone over the victim's clothing meticulously. Every seam, every pocket, every fold. Nothing. This cufflink, with its intricate, almost microscopic etching of a stylized hawk, had to have been placed there after I'd finished my initial examination. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a simple accident anymore. I turned the bag over in my gloved hand, the cool plastic a stark contrast to the rising heat in my chest. The hawk. I'd seen that symbol before. It was on the corporate letterhead of Nova Tech, the company that owned the research facility. A subtle, almost artistic logo, easily overlooked if I weren't looking for it. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice rougher than I intended. The chief medical examiner shook her head. "Just the usual. Rigor mortis consistent with time of death. No obvious signs of trauma beyond what the fall would inflict. But that cufflink..." She trailed off, her gaze meeting mine. We both knew what it meant. Someone had been in the lab after the victim was discovered. Someone who knew I was there. Someone who wanted me to know they'd been there. Back at my temporary office, a sterile, windowless room within the facility's administrative wing, I spread out the crime scene photos. The victim lay sprawled on the polished concrete floor, the ventilation shaft dark, gaping more above him. I zoomed in on the area around his body, scrutinizing every pixel. There, faintly visible, almost swallowed by the shadows, was a smudge of something dark on the pristine floor, just a few feet from where the victim's head had landed. It hadn't been there when I first arrived. Had it, my mind raced, replaying every step, every observation. The initial report mentioned a brief power surge, a system glitch that coincided with the man's death. A glitch that had conveniently wiped the security logs for that crucial 10-minute window. I leaned back in my chair, the cheap plastic groaning under my weight. This was no accident. The cufflink, the smudge, the wiped logs, they were all pieces of a deliberate puzzle. Someone was playing a game, and I was the pawn. My gut clenched. Nova Tech. They were developing some kind of advanced energy conduit, a project shrouded in secrecy. But this felt more personal, more targeted. My colleague, the junior investigator assigned to assist me, knocked softly on the door. "Blake, the director wants to see I. Something about the facility's power grid. Acting up again, or was it being made to act up?" "All right," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the unease churning within me. "Let's go see the director." As I walked down the sterile corridors, the polished floors reflecting the harsh overhead lights, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The Hawk cufflink felt heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the unseen predator circling me. The killer knew I was on their trail, and now they were making their presence known, not just through subtle clues, but through direct interference. The game had just escalated, and the stakes were rising with every passing minute. I had to find out who was pulling the strings and why they were willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. The rain outside intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the reinforced glass, mirroring the growing urgency in my own heart. This was no longer just a case. It was a hunt, and I was both the hunter and the hunted. The air in the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. It clung to the back of my throat, a persistent whisper of the grim work that had brought me here. Outside, the storm raged, each gust of wind rattling the panes and making the fluorescent lights flicker. My colleague, the stern-faced pathologist, was hunched over a microscope, his brow furrowed in concentration. Anything new? I wondered, my voice cutting through the hum of the ventilation system. He didn't look up immediately. The toxicology report is back for the deceased. Standard stuff, mostly. Nothing out of the ordinary for someone who worked around volatile compounds, but no immediate indicators of foul play. He finally pushed away from the eyepiece, rubbing his tired eyes. Still, there's something. A cellular anomaly in the tissue samples. It's subtle, but it's there. Doesn't fit with a simple accident. I leaned closer, my gaze sweeping over the array of instruments and slides spread across the stainless steel counter. Anomaly how? It's like accelerated cellular degradation, but localized. Almost as if something targeted specific cells, breaking them down from the inside. I've never seen anything quite like it outside of controlled lab conditions, and even then, it's usually under intense radiation or specific chemical exposure. This is cleaner, more precise. My mind flashed back to the research facility, the sterile white walls, the hushed efficiency of the scientists. They were working on something cutting-edge, something that promised to revolutionize. What exactly? The facility's official designation was Advanced Materials Research, but the hushed tones and the heavy security suggested more. And the cause of death, I pressed. Asphyxiation, the pathologist stated, tapping a report. Pure and simple. His airways were completely constricted. No external marks, no bruising, nothing to suggest manual strangulation. It's like he was crushed from the inside out, but without any physical trauma. He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. It's a puzzle, Blake, a real puzzle. I walked over to the large window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The facility was miles from anywhere, nestled in a remote valley. An accident that would be difficult to investigate, a killer even more so. The Hawk cufflink in my pocket felt warmer now, a strange, almost comforting weight. I'd found it tucked inside the deceased's lab coat pocket, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. Now, with the pathologist's words echoing in my ears, it felt like a key. A hawk, a predator. Did you find any trace evidence on the body? I inquired, turning back. A few fibers, nothing conclusive. Standard lab wear, and a faint residue on his skin near the neck. We're running tests, but it's barely there. Almost like it evaporated. Evaporated. The word sent a shiver down my spine. It fit with the cellular anomaly, with the internal strangulation. I thought about the project the deceased had been working on, the one that had been so heavily guarded, the one that involved sonic resonance frequencies. What if it wasn't just about materials? What if they'd stumbled onto something biological? I need to see the facility's research logs for the deceased's project, I said, my voice firm. And I need access to the lab where he was working, every single piece of equipment, every sample. The pathologist nodded. I'll put in the request, but they're not exactly forthcoming with information, I know that. I knew. The corporate suits had been tight-lipped from the moment I arrived. They wanted this case closed, chalked up to a tragic accident, and buried as quickly as possible. But that cellular anomaly, that internal strangulation, it wasn't an accident. It was a murder, executed with a precision that chilled me to the bone. Back in my temporary office at the facility, the air felt even more stifling than in the lab. The rain had intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the corrugated metal roof of the modular building. I spread out the photographs of the deceased's workspace. The meticulous order of the lab was unnerving. Everything was in its place, except for a small, overturned beaker near the workbench. It was barely noticeable in the photos, easily dismissed as a minor spill. But something about it snagged my attention. I zoomed in, enhancing the image. The residue from the spill was a faint, almost iridescent sheen. And there, caught in the light, was a single, impassably fine filament. It was almost invisible, like a spider's silk, but it shimmered with the same unnatural sheen as the residue. My breath hitched. Sonic resonance. Frequencies. What if they'd weaponized sound? What if they'd created a device, a targeted frequency, that could induce cellular breakdown and constriction without leaving a trace? The Hawk cufflink. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a clue. A signature. The killer was someone with intimate knowledge of the facility's technology, someone who could manipulate it with deadly intent. I pulled up the personnel files, cross-referencing them with the project team. My eyes scanned the names, the faces, the brief bios. Then I stopped. One name stood out, the lead engineer on the sonic resonance project. He had a background in bioacoustics and a reputation for being brilliant, but also ruthless. And his access logs showed him being present in the vicinity of the deceased's lab on the night of the incident, despite his official alibi. The precision, the lack of evidence, the internal cellular damage, it all pointed to a highly sophisticated method. A method that someone with a deep understanding of the facility's cutting-edge research could employ. I looked again at the photograph of the overturned beaker. The filament, the residue, the hawk. It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. The killer wasn't just sophisticated. They were right here, walking the same sterile corridors, breathing the same recycled air. And they had just committed their masterpiece. I knew who it was, and I knew how they'd done it. Now I just had to prove it. The storm outside mirrored the tempest brewing inside me. It was time to confront the hawk. The air in the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, hung thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something sharp and sterile. It always did, but tonight it felt charged, a static hum beneath the steady drumming of the downpour against the glass. I stared at the monitor, the grainy digital image of the deceased's internal scans filling the screen. The cellular anomaly, the microscopic tears around the carotid artery, it was still there. Undeniable. Not the work of faulty equipment or a freak electrical surge. This was deliberate. Anything new, Blake? The voice, raspy with fatigue, belonged to the technician. He was a ghost in the periphery, usually, a silent presence tending to the humming machinery that kept this grim place alive. Tonight, though, his presence felt watchful. Just confirming what I already knew, I murmured, my gaze still locked on the screen. The corporate suits had been tight-lipped from the moment I arrived at that remote research facility. But this cellular anomaly, this internal strangulation, it wasn't an accident. It was a murder, executed with a precision that sent a shiver down my spine. I zoomed in on a particular section of the scan, a cluster of cells that looked unnervingly uniform, almost manufactured. It was the same signature I'd seen on the preliminary reports, the one they'd dismissed as a processing error. But it wasn't an error. It was a tool, a weapon. A faint tremor ran through the floor, subtle enough that the technician didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he did, and chose to ignore it. I felt it, though, a low thrumming that vibrated up through the soles of my boots. The facility's backup generators, I'd been told, were state-of-the-art, but this felt different. This felt like something being dislodged. My eyes flicked to the reinforced door of the lab. It was usually locked from the outside, requiring a keycard swipe. I hadn't heard anyone approach, no footsteps on the linoleum, no metallic click of a lock. Yet a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air pressure told me something had changed. "I hear that?" I asked, my voice low. The technician frowned, tilting his head. "Hear what? Just the rain?" "No, underneath that, like a deep hum." I pushed away from the console, my senses on high alert. The rhythmic drumming of the rain suddenly seemed less like background noise and more like a deliberate distraction. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant vibration that made the glass in the specimen cabinets rattle. Then, a low, grinding sound, like massive gears turning, echoed from somewhere beyond the lab's thick walls. My gut clenched. This wasn't a generator kicking in. This was the facility itself waking up. My gaze swept across the lab, cataloging exits, potential hiding places, anything that could serve as a weapon. The stainless steel examination tables, the heavy dissecting instruments, the sealed containment units. Not exactly ideal for a confrontation, but better than nothing. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then died, plunging the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows into near total darkness. Only the faint, emergency glow of the exit signs offered any illumination, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the movement of the rain. "What the hell?" the technician stammered, his voice laced with alarm. "Power's out," I said, my voice deliberately calm, though my heart rate had definitely picked up. "Stay put." I reached for the heavy-duty flashlight I kept clipped to my belt, its beam cutting a sharp white swath through the gloom. I swept it across the room, the light catching on the glint of metal, the sterile surfaces, the unnervingly still forms under the draped sheets. Nothing. Then a soft click. Not from the door, but from the far wall near a large, industrial-looking ventilation grate. It was the sound of a latch being disengaged. My breath hitched. I moved towards it, my flashlight beam fixed on the grate. The grinding noise from before was louder now, directly behind it. It wasn't just a hum, it was the sound of something massive being moved. "Blake, someone's trying to get out," I said, my hand reaching for the edge of the grate. It was heavy, secured with bolts. "Or in." As my fingers brushed the cold metal, the grate swung inward with surprising speed, revealing not a ventilation shaft, but a dark, narrow passageway. The grinding intensified, accompanied by a rush of cool, damp air. And then a figure emerged from the opening, silhouetted against an even deeper blackness. It wasn't the corporate suits. It wasn't security. In their hand, glinting under my flashlight beam, was a device I'd only seen in the most classified schematics, a sonic emitter capable of inducing cellular disruption. I was hoping I'd be more compliant. The stranger's voice was synthesized, devoid of emotion. It came from a mask that covered their entire face. My flashlight beam wavered for a fraction of a second. This was the killer. Not just a hired hand, but someone who knew this facility, knew its hidden passages, and possessed technology far beyond anything I'd anticipated. The cellular anomaly wasn't a weapon they'd used. It was a weapon they'd developed. "We're not leaving," I stated, my grip tightening on the flashlight, my mind racing. I had to buy time. I had to get a signal out. The stranger took a step forward, the sonic emitter raising. "This facility, it's about to become very unstable, and I am in the wrong place when the foundation shifts." The grinding sound reached a crescendo, and I felt a violent jolt shudder through the entire building. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The technician cried out, stumbling back. This was it. The carefully constructed facade of an accident was crumbling, and the real purpose of this place, and the danger it represented, was about to be unleashed. And I was caught in the middle. The grinding sound stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving an echoing silence that pressed in on my eardrums. Dust motes, illuminated by the weak emergency lights, danced in the disturbed air. The technician, a young man whose name I'd barely registered through the haze of the past few days, let out a shaky breath. He was pale, his eyes wide, fixed on the now silent machinery. What was that?" he stammered, his voice raspy. I didn't answer immediately. My gaze swept over the room, cataloging the disarray. The tremor had been violent enough to dislodge a few more ceiling panels, revealing a tangle of wires and conduits I hadn't noticed before. This wasn't just a storage facility, it was a nerve center. And whatever had just happened, it wasn't an accident, not anymore. "That," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the lingering unease, was the sound of a system failing, or perhaps a system being deliberately shut down. I walked over to the control panel, its screen now a blank, dead slate. The technician flinched as I reached out, my gloved finger hovering over a scorched port. "This looks like an overload," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "But not a natural one." He edged closer, peering at the panel. "The power surges here are unpredictable, that's what we've been told." And I believed it. I turned, meeting his anxious gaze. The rain outside intensified, a drumming rhythm against the thick glass of the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows. It was a constant, mournful sound, fitting for the growing dread in my gut. "The truth," I said. "Or at least the parts of it that didn't fit the narrative they fed." I gestured to the now inert machinery. "This whole place is a lie, isn't it? A very expensive, very elaborate lie." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "They said it was for advanced material testing, for aerospace." "Aerospace," I repeated, a dry chuckle escaping my lips. "Right, and the accidental deaths, they were those for stress testing the materials too." He recoiled as if struck. I didn't know about any deaths. Didn't I?" I leaned in, my eyes boring into his. Or did I just choose not to see them? The missing persons reports, the hushed conversations among the senior staff, the constant security patrols that seemed more like guards keeping us in than keeping others out. He looked genuinely bewildered, or perhaps he was a very good actor. I dealt with enough of them in my line of work. I do my job. I maintain the equipment. And what happens when the equipment is used for something it wasn't designed for? I pressed. What happens when it's used to neutralize threats? The technician took a step back, his hands coming up defensively. "I don't know what Ire's talking about." "I think I do," I said, my tone hardening. "I think I know more than Ire's letting on, and I think Ire's just as much a victim of this as anyone else who's been caught in their web." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "But that doesn't absolve not completely." I turned away from him, walking towards the main door of the lab. The grinding sound had been a distraction, a calculated move to draw attention away from something else. What had it been? The seismic sensors had registered it, of course. But what had it done? There was a sub-level, rarely accessed, labeled simply as containment. What was being contained down there, and how did the accident play into it? I glanced back at the technician, who was still standing by the defunct control panel, looking lost. "Stay here," I ordered, my voice firm. "Don't touch anything. I need to see what else they've tried to bury." He didn't protest. He just nodded, a silent, defeated gesture. I pulled out my comm unit, the signal still weak but present. "Blake to control," I subvocalized. "I need a full sweep of this sector, priority Alpha, and get me a secure line to my superior. Tell them the asset is compromised and we need immediate extraction, and that they need to be ready for anything." As I waited for a response, my gaze drifted to the rain-lashed windows. The drops traced erratic paths down the glass, distorting the already bleak landscape outside. This place was a tomb, built to hide a secret that was now threatening to spill out. And the grinding sound, the jolt, it was the prelude. The real fallout was yet to come. I could feel it, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the crumbling infrastructure and everything to do with the unseen forces still at play. The technician might be a pawn, but the players behind the scenes were still very much in the game. And I was in their arena. The air in the forensic pathology lab, rain streaking the windows, was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic, coppery. It clung to the back of my throat. I'd been staring at the specimen slides for what felt like hours, the fluorescent lights humming a low, insistent drone that did little to cut through the persistent drizzle outside. Each drop seemed to echo the slow drip of my own unease. The initial findings were clear, or at least they had been. A fall, a nasty one, from a catwalk high above the main atrium of the facility. A preliminary report from the responding officers painted a picture of a tragic accident. A slip on wet metal, a broken neck. Simple, too simple. My gut had been screaming from the moment I stepped onto the grounds of that isolated research complex. The security was too tight for an accident, the layout too deliberate. I'd re-examined the victim's clothing, the fibers under the microscope, the faint trace evidence. Nothing screamed foul play, not in the traditional sense. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle that couldn't be explained by the desperate scrabble for purchase on a slick surface. But the subtle inconsistencies gnawed at me. The specific angle of the fracture, for one, It didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple fall. It suggested a force, a sharp, precise impact that a mere tumble wouldn't produce. Then, there was the data log I'd managed to pull from the victim's personal device. Encrypted, of course. It took me a solid day to crack it, fueled by lukewarm coffee and sheer stubbornness. The entry spoke of phase gamma, of unforeseen side effects, and a growing fear that the project was veering dangerously off course. The victim, a junior researcher named Thorne, had been documenting irregularities, anomalies that were being dismissed by higher-ups. I pushed a slide aside, the glass whispering against the polished steel of the lab bench. My gaze drifted to the specimen jars, each containing a piece of a puzzle I was still struggling to assemble. The internal injuries, meticulously catalogued, were what had truly thrown me. Beyond the obvious trauma from the fall, there were microscopic signs of cellular disruption, a pattern that didn't align with any known trauma. It was like the body had been stressed at a level I couldn't immediately identify. The grinding sound, the jolt I'd felt in the elevator on the way down, just before Thorne's death, I dismissed it as a malfunction, a common enough occurrence in aging infrastructure. But now, with the pieces of Thorne's log and the strange cellular damage swimming in my mind, it felt like a deliberate act, a warning, or worse, a trigger. My colleague, the lead investigator on this case, had been all business. "Blake, the evidence points to an accident. Let's wrap this up. We've got other cases waiting." He was a good man by the book, but sometimes his adherence to procedure felt like a blindfold. He couldn't see the shadows moving just beyond the edges of his flashlight beam. I leaned back, the worn leather of my chair creaking in protest. I traced a condensation trail on the window with my finger. The rain had intensified, blurring the distant lights of the city into watercolor smudges. Thorne wasn't just a victim of an accident. He was a casualty of something far more calculated. The facility's primary project, masked as advanced atmospheric research, was something else entirely. Thorne's logs, pieced together with fragmented data from the facility's network that I'd illicitly accessed, pointed towards an experimental energy source, a device capable of manipulating localized gravitational fields. The grinding sound and jolt I'd experienced, that was the device being tested. Thorne's fall wasn't an accident. It was a consequence of someone or something using that technology to eliminate a problem. But who? The facility's director, a man with a perpetual sneer and eyes that never quite met mine, was the obvious suspect. He had the motive Thorne was threatening to expose the illegal and dangerous nature of their research. Yet the sophistication of the act, it felt beyond a simple push. The cellular damage, it wasn't from the fall. It was from exposure. Thorne had likely been caught in the periphery of a test, a subtle shift in gravity that had caused him to lose his footing, but also had caused internal damage. The fall was a convenient, deniable byproduct. The killer hadn't just pushed Thorne, they had manipulated the very forces Thorne was studying. I stood up, my joints stiff. The metallic tang in the air seemed stronger now. Under a higher magnification, I could see it wasn't blood. It was a residue, a fine particulate matter that shimmered with an almost unnatural luminescence. It matched trace elements I'd found on Thorne's recovered personal tools he'd been using to recalibrate sensors. This wasn't corporate espionage in the traditional sense. This was about controlling a technology that could redefine physics, and Thorne had been too close to understanding its true potential and its dangers. The director would be brought in, of course. I had enough to make that happen. The evidence, while circumstantial, would be enough to launch a full investigation, to freeze the project, to hopefully bring the people responsible to justice. I looked back at the slides, at the silent testament of Thorne's final moments. It wasn't a neat resolution, not the kind I'd find in a textbook. There was no single smoking gun, just a series of unsettling questions that pointed to a truth far more complex and terrifying than a simple accidental death. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the glass, a somber soundtrack to my contemplation. The case was closing, but the implications of what I'd uncovered were only just beginning to unfold. My work here was done, but the world felt a little less stable, a little more fragile. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this wouldn't be the last time I encountered technology that blurred the lines between science and something far more dangerous.